Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome to IPRI's podcast. Today, we're joined with a very special guest, Ambassador Khalil Hashmi. Ambassador Hashmi currently serves as the permanent representative of Pakistan to the United Nations and other international organizations in Geneva. Previously, Ambassador Hashmi has served as Director General United Nations at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Islamabad. He has also served as the Director General European Region, Director General Arms Control, and Director for Disarmament Affairs. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. So, sir,
Thank you for having me.
the ambit of our conversation today is going to focus on Pakistan and its relationship with the United Nations. And since you've spent most of your career with dealing with the United Nations from Pakistan's perspective, we thought you're the ideal person to have this conversation with. So I'm just going to jump into my first question, which is that Pakistan has been a member of the United Nations since its inception in 1947. So, since that time to now, what are the primary objectives and goals of Pakistan's participation in this international organization?
Maham, thank you first for having me. I'm not sure I'm the ideal person. There are many stalwarts. There are many others who have done much more at the United Nations for Pakistan and for the larger good. So it's been 2/3 of a century now that we have been an independent state and joined the United Nations. Just I think 3 days ago, it marks the 76th anniversary of the joining of Pakistan, joining of the United Nations by Pakistan, 30th of September 1947. I think within the larger foreign policy, Pakistan's participation and contribution to the UN forms a major DNA, if I can call it. Since our joining of this organization, and the reasons are pretty obvious. First, if you look at probably Article 40 of the Constitution of Pakistan, you see the reasons clearly listed out there. And one of the key reasons is that Pakistan will always side with countries from the Muslim world and also countries from the developing world. So first and foremost, one of the key objectives for Pakistan is to articulate how we see the world, how it should be, for instance, the world in which over 7 billion people live, how it can be more peaceful, how it can be more inclusive, how it can be more fairer, and how it can be more prosperous. So that entails different levels of engagement. And of course, we articulate it through our statements, through chairing of different platforms or committees. That's one major part of it, articulating our views or our worldview on a host of issues. The second is to also inform the world about our own national priorities, our regional priorities, and our external priorities in our external relations. So not just the priorities, but also where we see some concerns, we articulate those. Where we see we can contribute, we do that as well. And at a third level, there are thematic issues, for instance, peacekeeping, counterterrorism, peaceful resolution of conflicts, sustainable development, and so on and so forth. Islamophobia, for instance, a major contemporary issue, decolonization, right to self-determination. There are many aspects. So these are the different levels in which we engage, and these are the main objectives of our participation at the United Nations.
Perfect, sir. And sir, carrying forward from that is that Pakistan has been heavily involved with the United Nations. Can you highlight some of the key milestones in Pakistan's relationship with the UN over the years. For instance, we all know that Pakistan has historically played an essential role in the UN's peacekeeping missions.
Sure. Yes, peacekeeping, that's something started, Pakistan started participating from 1960 onwards. Pakistan is one of the largest and at times has been the largest troop contributing country. Um, so since the 1960s, we have participated over 29 countries, 46 missions, having contributed over 200,000 troops, but also police personnel. So this, by any yardstick, is a substantial contribution to regional and world peace. In the process, our soldiers, 168 of our soldiers, laid their lives. So that's certainly a major contribution, but that's not just the only contribution. Pakistan played a significant role during the decolonization process in the 1960s, out of which many countries gained independence. We have shaped uh, and contributed to shaping of the global norms. For instance, the right to self-determination is one of them. We have chaired several committees of the United Nations in each area, whether it is peace and security, whether it is development, whether it is even human rights. In terms of peace and security, for instance, in Geneva, particularly, we have made concrete proposals on how best to contain the use of nuclear weapons. For instance, we have made a proposal that there should be an international legal instrument guaranteeing the non-nuclear weapon states that they will not be attacked. This is a proposal we made in 1979 in the Conference on Disarmament. By the way, this was one of the first ones. We have also made proposals in the Biological Weapons Convention. We have chaired the review conference of the Biological Weapons Convention. More recently, we are very pleased to have been the first country to make a concrete proposal in the Conference on Disarmament that the military application of artificial intelligence and its security and stability impacts is an area that needs to be regulated. And it's important to start a conversation in the Conference on Disarmament and to subsequently lead to enact some guardrails, because the implications are too, or the stakes are too high for us as international community to ignore. So a lot of areas in the Human Rights Council, for instance, this year in July, Pakistan led the Organization of Islamic Conference, and we called for an urgent debate in the Human Rights Council to look at these growing acts of religious hatred that were manifested in the continued deliberate desecration of the Holy Quran. And we secured a resolution. So all of these examples go to show you that there are several areas where we in the past as Pakistan, but also continue to try and make an impact to make our concrete contribution to several areas that impinge on the peace, security, development of the world.
Thank you, sir, for highlighting a lot of issues that most people actually don't even know that Pakistan participates in at the United Nations. And so, coming on to current affairs, we've seen a number of issues that Pakistan could potentially raise at the UN. So, in your opinion, what is the most crucial issue on the international agenda that Pakistan is actively addressing with the United Nations, or an issue that you feel that Pakistan should actively pursue at the UN?
Well, I would say that they're all topical issues or very contemporary issues, urgent issues Pakistan is deeply engaged in. For instance, climate change. So that's something we have been actively engaging. We are still engaged. Um, for example, we led the group of 77 in China, which is the which is over 132 countries, grouping of developing countries. We were chairing it last year. Unfortunately, the devastating flood hit Pakistan last year, and then we went to Sharm el-Sheikh for the climate conference that is convened annually. This was Egypt. So we proposed and then pushed for first inclusion in the agenda of the conference loss and damage fund, because as we know, many of the developing countries, especially Pakistan, our carbon footprint is 0.5 or 6%, not even 1%, but we are disproportionately affected. Last year, floods caused us nearly $30 billion of damages. So we led the developing countries, and then an agreement was reached last year on the loss and damage fund. But that's just one piece of the larger question of climate change. We are very active on mobilizing international finance for climate adaptation, for climate mitigation. The other issue, the emerging issue, is I just mentioned the artificial intelligence and its integration into weapon systems and arms, whether it is nuclear weapons or others. This is where we are also very actively engaged. We have, as I mentioned earlier, we have been proactive. We are the first country which has put a concrete proposal on the table that this is something that needs to, a conversation has to start, and then we have to develop some rules of the road before it is too late. When it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, the UN Sustainable Development Agenda, we have all again been very active in New York, in Geneva as well. The UN Secretary General has presented a new agenda for peace, and we have presented a concrete and a detailed paper on how we see the proposals that have been put forward by the Secretary General. So on each area, whether it is peace and security, whether it is sustainable development, whether it is human rights, whether it is other social issues, economic issues, we have been very active, and not just making statements, making concrete proposals, leading various groupings, and so on and so forth.
Perfect. And so now we're just going to, now that we've highlighted Pakistan's contribution to the UN overall and how Pakistan interacts with it, I think we're now going to move on to the current UNGA session. And so starting with, what are some of the recent contributions made by Pakistan in the UN General Assembly's session?
So first of all, this year, the main activity at the United Nations was the Sustainable Development Goals Summit. And more specifically, the idea was that due to the pandemic and Ukraine-related conflict, energy, and other issues, we know global inflation has increased. The funding available for climate or for other the larger issues of sustainable development goals has been lagging. So this summit was organized by the UN Secretary General during the high-level session of the General Assembly. This was the main highlight. This was organized to mobilize more funding, to spotlight that here we have a vision. We have about 7 years left, 2030 agenda. And the financing required to achieve these goals is drastically short. There is now, people are talking about $4 to $5 trillion annual gap to achieve those goals. So that was one particular area that where we shared our perspective, shared our suggestions at the summit. Also, climate change, again, there were climate change related also meetings where the Prime Minister participated. And again, we took the opportunity to inform the world on the deficit of financing that is there on the climate front. So we again highlighted the need to operationalize the loss and damage fund. The third area was health. There were, after the pandemic, there has been a lot of effort to put together an international pandemic treaty to prevent the future pandemics. So that was also another area where we highlighted issues related to the developing the capacity of developing countries, because the weak links, if we do not address those weak links, and they could be in some developing countries, all it takes is for a virus or a pathogen to travel from one place to another. And so that requires strengthening capacities to monitor, to surveil, and then to prevent, to prepare yourself. So a lot of effort is underway. The main effort, the negotiations are going to start in Geneva, but the high-level segment of this took place in the UN General Assembly. So there were a lot of other activities. For instance, there were occasions to share our perspective on counterterrorism, share our perspective on how we see the atrocities being committed in Jammu and Kashmir by India, how the illegal occupation is impacting the rights of Kashmiris on peacekeeping. So a host of issues. So it was all in all a very substantive participation by Pakistan in keeping with the tradition that we have.
And sir, now, following up on something you've said in this is Pakistan's issue with India regarding the illegal occupation of Jammu and Kashmir. And so what role do you feel that the UN should play in mediating and resolving regional conflicts, particularly in South Asia? Because the kind of geopolitical situation we live in right now, there are a number of issues that are cropping up.
Yes, so the United Nations Charter provides a range of tools to resolve conflicts, to resolve disputes, to address human rights violations, and so on and so forth. So we have been making several attempts. First and foremost is we draw attention of the United Nations, the UN Security Council, the international community at large, that there are a dozen UN Security Council resolutions. And under Article 25 of the UN Charter, every member state is bound to implement the decisions of the UN Security Council resolutions. So there is a clear case that India is not implementing those Security Council resolutions, because those Security Council resolutions specifically ask for convening of a plebiscite under the United Nations auspices to allow the Kashmiris to decide their fate. That, unfortunately, has not taken place since 1948. Secondly, we have repeatedly encouraged the UN Secretary General to play his role, the mediating role, or what we call the good offices. That's something that is also available under the UN Charter. We have also indicated publicly that we would be open to any UN or non-UN led effort to either mediate or to help resolve the fundamental question of Jammu and Kashmir. And by the way, this is something, Jammu and Kashmir dispute remains very much on the agenda of the UN Security Council. Here in Geneva, we shine light on the various dimensions of human rights and various abuses and violations that Kashmiri people continue to be subjected to. So it's not something that we alone are saying. There have been 2 reports by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. That's an independent office. It made an independent reporting in 2018 and 2019, documenting the series of violations that India is doing. And there are many UN experts who have publicly expressed concerns over the continuing violations, whether it is extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, torture, suppressing their right to freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, so on and so forth. So there are a range of tools that are available. Of course, it is clear that those tools are being rejected, continue to be rejected by India. So this is an open, question for everyone in the world to see whether a state which claims to be the largest democracy, a state um, which has aspirations to become a regional power, a state which wants to become a permanent member of the UN Security Council, whether it is um, we have to test its credentials, whether it is complying with international law, because UN Security Council resolutions are a part of international law, whether it is complying with its international human rights obligations, because India has signed many conventions to which it is a party and it is required to implement those, or whether India is really a responsible member of the international community. So the facts are out there, and independent people can make up their own determination whether India is fit for these roles or not.
Perfect, sir. And that does sum up the role that the UN should ideally be playing in regional conflicts. Sir, carrying forward from that, there are situations when international obligations come in contrast clash with national security objectives. So, in your opinion, how does Pakistan balance its national security interests with its responsibilities as a member of the United Nations, particularly when it comes to sensitive situations and issues like disarmament and non proliferation?
So, of course, there are, you know, always dilemmas and difficult situations, but Pakistan has always um, placed a lot of premium on international law, international legality. What I mean by that is the, for instance, take the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. Pakistan actively participated, negotiated the treaty, but chose not to sign, not unilaterally. We always said that given the peculiar strategic environment in South Asia, Pakistan cannot afford to unilaterally sign or ratify the non-proliferation treaty. So, but we also said and made proposals that we can simultaneously join the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. We can with India, we can simultaneously adopt the IAEA safeguards. We made several proposals. So when a country is judged as, or more to the question that you said, when there are, how do you balance where there are aspirations in the world that something on the nuclear front or arms should happen, and then there are national security imperatives for a country like Pakistan, and how do you balance it? Well, we balance it of international legality. We are not a party to nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So where we are a treaty party, for instance, the Biological Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, there are many other treaties where we are a party, and we have faithfully complied with the provisions of those the provisions of those treaties. So when it comes to this dilemma, we explain to the world. For instance, there is a lot of talk, in the public space that a fissile material cutoff treaty should come about, and we have made a case saying that if a treaty on fissile material is indeed necessary, but banning the production of fissile material will not advance nuclear disarmament objectives. And we have given reasons, and we have put our proposal in the CD, explaining that a real contribution to nuclear disarmament or reduction of nuclear weapons would be to have a fissile materials treaty which has in its scope the thousands of metric ton of fissile material that has been produced by some states. So it is these states who want to ban the future production of fissile material, but are not prepared to touch the thousands of tons of fissile material which can produce thousands of nuclear weapons. So we are saying that bring those, so it has to be a balance. We bring in those stocks and we talk about future production. That would be the real test of looking at the fissile material cutoff treaty, making a contribution to nuclear disarmament or to the vision of a world without nuclear weapons. So these are some of the ways: international legality, and then, of course, articulating where we are, why are we taking this position, and how it impinges on our national security. And these are things which are pretty legitimate, and these are part of universal principles that have been agreed within the arms control arena. So, for example, the first special session of the UN General Assembly in 1978 agreed on a final document which stipulates principles and which stipulates an action plan on nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation. So one of those principles that are agreed is that every state has an equal right to security. Now we explain that how in a particular situation our security is being impacted by a particular proposal that is being presented, and how that proposal needs to adjust. And this is not something that we have argued alone. There have been other countries who, for the same reason, argue that unless the scope of a particular proposal is adjusted where the security, the right to security of all states is secured, it won't, go forward. The same document also, and the principle is that the adoption of disarmament measures should take place on an equitable and balanced basis. And at no stage, any state or a group of states should be able to take advantage over others. So these are things what we are saying is, it's not something out of thin air. These are very much principles which are part of existing normative framework on arms control and nuclear disarmament.
So, if I understand that correctly, what you're saying is that our focus is on our international law obligations and us abiding by that. And so we maneuver the United Nations framework, looking at our national security interests and our obligations under international law.
Well, we don't maneuver the United Nations system. We explain that this is what the provisions of international normative framework are, which is the UN Charter, the international treaties, the international norms or principles that I referred to. And this is what we are tapping into, what the international legality provides for. So it's not that we are trying to take advantage of anything. We are just utilizing the available international framework for everyone. So that's our job. Part of our job is to explain, to highlight where we are coming from, and we listen to what others are coming from, and then we try and find a common ground. In some cases, things work quickly. In some cases, where hardcore national security concerns are involved, things take time. It's just the way it has been.
Thank you, sir. And we're going to wrap up with our final question, which is going to be looking at the future. What future goals and priorities does Pakistan have that it wants addressed at the United Nations in the coming future?
Well, first and foremost, for every state, there are, interconnected priorities. For instance, um, it's the national security. And when we say national security, is not necessarily the physical security that we're talking about. We're also talking about economic security. We're also talking about energy security. So security is something every state puts a lot of premium on. The second priority for any states, particularly those developing states, is development, which is to provide for a better standard of life for each of its citizens. What that means is to look for and leverage opportunities of international trade, investment, technology, so on and so forth. And the third area is to prevent yourself from the effects of things which are not in your control, which are transnational, for instance, climate change, for instance, pandemic, for instance, what's happening in the cyberspace. So these are things not only happening in your national space, but they are also coming, they are in a space which is not necessarily under your control. So going forward, we will continue to work in each of these areas, whether it is development, whether it is peace and security, whether it is human rights. And there is an important milestone coming up next year that the UN Secretary General is hosting a summit of the future. So what he has presented as a new agenda for peace, there are several proposals on which a lot of discussion would take place. And based on those discussions, some of those things which are agreeable would come in the form of a declaration or a form of a resolution or a form of a roadmap for the future. So we are actively engaged in those processes. Here in Geneva also, we will continue to be very active on the human rights front, on the arms control front, on the development front, on a host of issues. We were very pleased to chair this year alone at least 3 or 4 committees. I myself chaired in the development area, for instance. I chaired the World Intellectual Property Organizations Committee on Development. I chaired the International Labor Organizations Committee on Standards. I am currently president of the Trade and Development Board of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development. So it's within the Human Rights Council, we lead the Organization of Islamic Conference, the OIC's group in Geneva on human rights and humanitarian affairs. So it's a lot that we are engaged with, and the purpose of this engagement, and going back to the first question, was to not just represent Pakistan, but represent its aspirations, its priorities, its concerns. But more than that, to by doing this, by actively engaging and participating, bring benefits to our people in the form of peace or sustainable development and human rights for everyone.
Thank you, sir. And thank you so much for joining us and taking time out from your extremely busy schedule. We're always grateful for your help and support in advocating for international law and national security by IPRI. We look forward to seeing you at our future podcasts. Thank you.